I see it's 11 after, and we've picked up
Yeah.
a few more people, but I think we're leveling off. So
yeah,
go ahead and get started.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you everybody for attending another IR session. Really appreciate it. I've known Gaines for a number of years now. We met first at 𝐒𝐿 here at Atlantic Beach, and then obviously very supportive of Music City and his conference up there. Have been involved with that ever since its inception. So yeah, we were kind of catching up a few weeks back, and we mentioned kind of doing this session, and very excited to have him. So without further ado, Gaines, go ahead and get started. You're the host now. So thanks again for everybody.
Well, I appreciate it. So let's jump right into it. And my first, once I get focused on my slides, there we go. Anybody ever watched like the movie or the TV show, what was it, Limitless? And think like, if there was just a pill that could make your brain work like lightning fast, then I'd totally take it, even if there were some side effects, right? Would a boost to your creativity, your problem solving abilities be worth, say, having difficulty with memorization? Would greater success in your career be worth struggling more as a child in school? These are the sort of topics we're going to delve into. And I thought we'd kick things off with a unofficial ADHD test. So you can keep your own score. It's 1 point for yes to any of these questions. Some of them might give you more points. So if you think that might be too much to keep track of, then go ahead and give yourself 1 point, because that might indicate that you have some ADHD tendencies. Now keep in mind that I am not a doctor. This is not intended to diagnose you officially. There is a link in the slides for an official test, but it might be worth keeping in mind that the testing and the diagnosis is all around it being a condition. And one of the things we'll talk about is whether it's just a condition or just a state of being, or a different way of what we call neurodiversity. So if this sounds like that might be too much work, and if you're going to just use this test for diagnosis anyways, go ahead and give yourself another point. So we'll start off by talking about what ADHD is. As I mentioned, it tends to be associated with difficulties that people have in life. That's usually where it pops up, and how you separate out somebody who has these tendencies versus somebody that doesn't. Physicians use something called a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM. You might hear referred to as DSM-5, as version 5. And they say that there needs to be at least 5 negative symptoms that last for more than 6 months in order for the diagnosis to be applied. Now I'm going to challenge that approach, because I think that there's a lot more to it. For one thing, they've linked genetically lower dopamine transporter density, meaning that you have fewer spots in your brain that have been mapped out to release dopamine, which is the reward signal when you do something positive. So that right there indicates that like it's just a different way of being, not necessarily, I mean, that could lead to some of these difficulties, but it doesn't necessarily. And we find that this is usually diagnosed in children. About 1 in 10, the statistics show, are diagnosed at childhood, and very, very few are between 2 and 4% as adults. And I think that's not only because you've got some people who are caught at childhood, but I think it's more so because we develop coping mechanisms as we go through life to minimize the negative impacts. And then you're no longer going to diagnose it because it's no longer meeting that criteria of these things that negatively impact your life. So if you are interested in doing the official screening questionnaire, you can go to add.org. I've got some other links in the slides, which I'll share afterwards as well. So if you think that I'd spent too long on the definition of ADD, go ahead and give yourself a point. So how does this ADHD diagnosis present itself normally? Obviously, the inattention is a big one. So I just use the term ADD, which I might slip into. That's what we called it without the hyperactivity in the past. I think that term has been deprecated to all your developers in the crowd. So we just go with ADHD now, but it may present as inattentiveness. And that could be that you're making some mistakes that should be easy. You know, I know I did this in school. I I'd know everything on a test, and then I'd get it back and it was like a C, and it was like, oh, I knew all these things. How did I make the mistake of picking one multiple choice answer versus another? That's something that I experienced quite a bit. Obviously, the difficulty focusing, the easily distracted, and we'll talk about like ways that that manifests itself and ways we can minimize that impact. So if you go ahead and give yourself a point every time you lose track of what I'm saying moving forward. The next way it presents is hyperactivity or impulsivity. And so that tends to be more the kids who are disruptive for the rest of the class, right? And attention, that only generally harms the person who's inattentive. The hyperactivity and impulsivity, that's the kid who can't sit down, they tend to touch others. So fidget spinners became very popular for people who have that sort of tendency, who need something to focus on or something to get that energy out. I know my family and friends have gotten annoyed at times with me bouncing my foot, vibrating the floor, because I'm kind of a big guy, just from being a little bit of restless, even though I don't really have the hyperactivity. Some of these things still manifest. Interrupting others, can't wait to partake in the conversation or to jump into something. So if you're like me and you pace during phone calls, like you just can't sit still when your mind's going, go ahead and give yourself another point. So we talked about inattentiveness, hyperactivity, and then of course you've got situations where they're combined at different degrees. So if you're doing anything else at this point besides paying attention to the presentation, go ahead and give yourself 3 points. So I mentioned neurodiversity. For anybody who's not familiar with the term, it just means that brains can be different, right? They have different numbers of receptors of different types. You have different traits, different skills that are mental skills, which are stronger or weaker. So this has become very popular in the autism world because we've realized that there's a spectrum or a range or a lot of different factors which can be more or less significant depending on the individual. So when I approach this, I'm looking at this as there are different tendencies, there are different behaviors, different traits, and we align a lot of these with certain diagnoses, but whether you have that diagnosis or whether you have all or only some of them, hopefully you'll be able to take something away from this presentation, especially for the things that you find in yourself. It's also interesting that scientists believe that the ADHD brain, the tendencies that come with it, could have helped with evolution. When there were tribes that if they stayed in one spot, they might overhunt the area, right? Or they might have become agricultural, but climate changed over time. So it was the societies that had people who were restless, who were distracted from what they were doing at the moment and looking off into the distance and going to explore and wanting to being brave and even reckless and venturing out. And that could have contributed to the survival of those tribes, those people. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this, that I don't view the diagnosis of ADHD as an indicator that you're broken or that you're doomed to having issues throughout your life. I think a lot of times it's more in how you apply things than the right time, right place, right application than it is what they do. So I was doing some research on what benefits ADHD had and how that tends to manifest in the success of individuals. And I was surprised at how many people you and I would recognize that whether they were officially diagnosed or not, it's commonly believed, and many of them have personally stated, that they have these ADHD tendencies. In fact, Seth Godin is one of my favorite authors, and he does some great books on habits, and I'll introduce some of those insights later on in the presentation. One of the traits that I think leads to the success that a lot of these individuals have is that they're relentlessly determined to jump in and solve problems, and they come up with unexpected solutions. So they tend to be outliers, which that's very contrary to the tendency our society has to push people to assimilate and to become the same as others, right? And that tends to be the model we see in school, but as professionals out in the world, we actually tend to want to differentiate ourselves. And these are often called people who are twice exceptional. There's also a book that I might mention later in the talk called Faster Than Normal, which I highly recommend. It talks about a lot of the people who have found success with these tendencies. So in order to do this, we need to learn how to understand how to harness our brain. And the first thing we have to do is self-analysis. We have to understand, what are we good at? What are we bad at? What are our tendencies? So if you happen to think that you're good at self-analysis, go ahead and give yourself a point, because not many people with ADHD are actually good at self-assessment. There are a lot of beneficial traits though. Handling crisis well is one that is really interesting, because they've discovered that theta brainwaves have a big impact on how you perceive and react to situations. And the people who have an ADHD type of brain tend to have higher than normal levels of theta brainwaves, which that's what, when you're in a crisis mode, your theta brainwaves tend to drop. And for an average person, that's what causes them to panic and become inactive. But if you have higher than normal theta brainwaves, they believe that the crisis actually puts you in a more normal mode. And that may contribute to people who feel like they work better under pressure, like they work better against a deadline. They're really great when other people are panicking and unsure of how to handle a situation. They jump right in and take care of it. They also find that higher theta brainwaves, when you're relaxed, makes the subconscious more accessible. So that tends to lead towards better creativity and insight. The same trait that causes us to be distracted by things around us, well, we're distracted because we're noticing those things around us. And noticing things, even subconsciously, can tend to lead us to have a stronger intuition and be able to understand the context of what's going on in a way that others who don't take note of all those unnoticed aspects might not pick up on. People with ADHD also tend to avoid procedure and protocol and things that don't seem to work as well. They tend to look for unconventional solutions. And mentally, that can often mean that they're a very quick study, pick up concepts. That lack of ability to memorize that a lot of people find is balanced out by the ability to pick up concepts and ideas much more quickly. And then, of course, one of my favorites is hyperfocus. We'll talk about that in a bit too. So how do some of these things show up? Extreme focus is kind of it's not something you'd expect from somebody with ADHD, because we think about them being distracted a lot. But I find that if there's something that I'm passionate about, something that I'm quite interested in, and I give myself the right environment, I can focus in a way that it does not seem most people, it comes naturally to them. So if you're a software developer, for instance, and you've been up all night working on a project and you knock it out by the morning, and maybe that was a bad idea because you needed to be functional the next day, but you got a week's worth of work done in one night. That's the sort of extreme focus and attention that I'm talking about. Of course, that comes with it is the flip side, which is things that aren't as engaging, that aren't triggering the limited dopamine spots in your brain, tend to be more difficult to focus on. So a little disclaimer or a disclosure, I take Adderall for my ADHD. I take it only on days that I need to be productive. I know for me, it curbs my appetite, which can be a good or a bad thing. I have to more force myself to eat good meals while I'm on it. And of course, it will keep me up if I take it too late in the day, so I only take it early in the morning. And there are some other aspects that we could talk about as we go through the presentation, where I notice how it changes how I respond and how I perceive things. But that's a big assistant for me when it comes to being easily distracted during those things that aren't mentally as engaging. One way that I used to handle that is I used to work late at night because nobody was calling me, nobody needed anything from me. I could zero in. There were very few distractions. I know that a lot of people who don't have these tendencies do that for other reasons. Like maybe it's because you can play the game you want to play and nobody's pulling you away from it. So it's not specific to this mindset, but it certainly was something that's very strong in myself. I crave stimulation in a way that, like one way that I found recently in the past several years is I listen to audiobooks. And anytime that I'm not busy with something in particular, I'll often throw my earbuds in and put on an audiobook. And that meets that craving for stimulation. And sometimes I even realize that I've gotten distracted. I've not been paying attention to my book and I need to rewind it because I have no idea what's going on. But it gives me that kind of background. A lot of people listen to music as well. Heavy metal, I think, is very popular with a lot of developers because you can't really understand the lyrics. You don't get too distracted by what they're saying. It's just stimulation to help even things out. And then I personally appreciate, one of the things I appreciate most about myself is that when I do get invested in something, in a project, and I want to produce something, I try to be as perfect as I can on it. And I think that's a little bit different from what we think of as a perfectionist, where everything has to be perfect. I can care very little about most things, but if there's something that I want to accomplish and I want to do right, I tend to go 110% or more on that in particular. And as I mentioned, going overboard on some projects, not for others. And one side effect of that for me is knowing that I may have more difficulty than some other people in juggling multiple work streams or focuses. And knowing that I really want to invest myself to do what I'm doing well, I tend to avoid taking on new obligations and new projects. That way I can do what I'm doing very well and not spread myself too thin. So that was a long list of tendencies. If I went through that and you thought, well, this doesn't seem that out of the ordinary, I check most of these boxes, this is normal, and give yourself a few points. Maybe this would be a good time to stop for a second and see if there's any questions, since I don't have everybody's video up and I can't see how this is being received.
Hi, Gaines.
Hey.
This is Barbara Trapp. I posted a comment in the chat, but I want to tell you. So I'm a certified professional organizer and productivity coach, and most of my clients have ADHD or OCD or both. So my question is, do you find yourself more focused on these virtual meetings than in-person meetings? I'm finding that with my clients, it's working better because we are just face-to-face. They can't go off. So how do you feel about it?
It's a really good question. I think I make an environment where I have fewer distractions. So if I was in an office, that might not be the case. Mm-hmm. And I tend to take notes during my meetings because as I've alluded to, and we'll talk a little bit more about, I don't feel like my memory is the best. So I appreciate having like a OneNote where I can search and find things that I thought were important from past conversations and meetings. So that helps me stay focused. But I think in general, having video enabled is a big key. Like knowing that, like seeing other people and how they're responding and knowing that they can see you, that I think is the biggest thing that regardless of your brain type, it tends to encourage that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Any questions about anything we've covered so far before we jump into some of these specific tendencies?
Yeah, hi, this is Hetty, and I actually had a quick question. One thing that you touched upon was, I guess, being a perfectionist and differentiating that. I mean, how do you do that? Because in my opinion, and just kind of the way that I view things, it kind of runs along the same lines and to me is essentially the same thing. So I guess, can you walk me through that and how you've been able to identify the differentiators there?
You mean the difference between having a tendency to be, to strive for perfection in some things and not others versus being a general perfectionist?
Correct, yes.
Well, I guess from my perspective, it's simply that there are way more things in my life that I'm not a perfectionist about, that I don't really care if they're, I mean, I find them unimportant. They're not going to impact my life in a significant way. So I'm perfectly comfortable with them being subpar or just meeting the minimum criteria. But then there are other things where, like, building a costume. Like we do cosplay, and I've got a Vader costume, and trying to make that as like accurate to the screen as possible, and shooting for that like 98%, and then maybe hitting 80 or 90. It again doesn't really impact my life, but it's something I'm passionate about, and so it's something that I'm, rather than just going, well, this is good enough, I tend to take it that extra step, and it's a urge, a drive in me.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, my pleasure. So we actually will dive into that in a moment. But the next, I thought one of the biggest topics that tends to be central to this conversation is the hyperfocus and microfocus, like the difference between being able to zero in on something and not being able to focus on it at all. So how does this normally manifest itself? The zone, you've heard people talk about getting in the zone, and I'm sure most of you have had those moments where, or flow is another term people use for it. I mean, there's nothing unique about people with ADHD as far as getting into this headspace, but I do think that we have almost slots that you can fall into. Like if it's this sort of engagement, I can almost fall into that very easily versus another activity where it might be more difficult. The regulating attention span, it's worth mentioning, but I don't think we need to go into it too deeply because it's pretty obvious. So an example of this would be, you replace time-consuming entertainment with multiplayer games with other games that help you regulate that time, right? So if you're like me and you tend to get very focused on your driving and almost competitive, and even if you don't want to get to where you're going any earlier, you tend to want to drive efficiently and get there as quickly as possible, and maybe drive like a maniac. Go ahead and give yourself a point. In fact, give yourself two if you actually do drive better in those circumstances, if people tell you that, because the extreme focus is an actual aspect of that mentality. Another tendency is the stimulation craving. If you're big into skydiving, if you're always looking for new ways to get a rush, that could be a manifestation of this type. Can lead to destructive behavior. You could become restless with the norm and want something to be different and act out in a way that's maybe counter to your interests just to get that stimulation or that difference. That tends to be how it manifests in children. So if you've ever been standing in line and you're bored standing in line and you're thinking like, I could commit this crime instead of waiting in line, like I could rob that bank instead of waiting for the ATM, go ahead and give yourself a point. And then one of the tendencies that I have recently realized, like even after I started putting this presentation together, is you're familiar with the term object permanency, I'm guessing, with babies. Like when they're first born, if you hide something from them, they don't realize it exists. If somebody leaves the room, they could get really upset, more so than just if they realized they were right around the corner. There's something, I'm still researching it, but there's something with adults where people with ADHD seem to exist in the moment more than your average person. And I found that personally, I can have great relationships with family and friends and go weeks or even months without it crossing my mind to reach out to them or that I haven't talked to them in a while. And it has nothing to do with me not wanting to talk to them or spend time with them, but it's that out of sight, out of mind. And sometimes even things that are in sight. If you've ever walked past the same thing 20 times without addressing it, not because you were ignoring it purposefully or you didn't want to address it, like those clothes on the floor, but just because it never even occurred to you, it was not even something that you saw as you walked by it. That's something that I've noticed in myself as well. I tend to try to be better about responding to messages as soon as I get them, because I know if I don't, then I'll forget that it's out there. And if I don't notice it, it could be weeks or months before I reply. And then of course, then you start feeling guilty about not replying and it gets a little awkward. So we don't even want to go down that road. And I recently set up my workshop for doing woodworking and some other things. This pandemic has given me a little bit more time at home without traveling to conferences and such. And one thing that I noticed that I really appealed to me about organization techniques is some people, when they set up their workspace, they want to put everything on the wall or hang it or somehow make it visible so that you don't have to open a drawer or cabinet to get to it. And I really like that approach, not just for the efficiency of not having to open a drawer or cabinet or put it away there, but also if I see it, then it'll be in my mind that I can use it. And if it's put away in a cabinet, it may not even cross my mind that it's available. Anybody have any questions or thoughts about the last few tendencies we've discussed?
Gaines, it's Barbara again.
Hey, Barbara.
I love what you just said. I actually refer to my clients as innies or outies. Do you need to have things out where you can see them for the inspiration, or in so they're not a distraction? Most of them think they want to be an innie, but they really do need some things. Otherwise, it's out of sight is out of mind. So it's kind of a combination. But,
yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. I'll be interested in chatting with you more about it sometime.
sure.
I alluded earlier to the all or nothing tendency. While I think it's a huge benefit, there are some negative ways that this manifests. I do tend to avoid things that require me to only be invested at a limited extent. So it can be difficult sometimes to draw that line and to say, I'm only going to put forth this much effort. For instance, a group of us started a software development conference years ago, Music City Code, which grew into Music City Tech and became a much bigger event. And I started off leading that effort. And I realized that with all the things I was trying to do in my life, it would be better served for somebody else to take on that leadership role and for me to focus on these other things, other initiatives that I had. But it was also really difficult for me to find that balance between being 100% in it or stepping away 100% and figure out how to just be involved at the level that's needed and not more than that. So if you're known for being a perfectionist in some things and sloppy in others, go ahead and give yourself a point. So being a perfectionist can also lead to the tendency to procrastinate. Sometimes we want to do something so well that we get a little paralyzed, and how are we going to accomplish that? Sometimes you might even avoid activities that you don't think you can do well at all. I know that's the case for me. If there's something that I just don't think I could meet my own standards on it and it's not necessary, I'll avoid going down that road in the first place. I also do this for expense reasons. Like, I've never bought a quadcopter because I'm pretty sure that if I got into quadcopters, I'd have multiple models and I'd tinker with them and I'd have parts, and it would become this whole other hobby that was with clutter and cost. So sometimes I rein myself in from that perspective. And by the way, with all these tendencies, we're going to revisit these and talk about coping mechanisms and ways we can control them. So give yourself a point for every hobby you've picked up that you've started in the last year, max of 30 points. And while we're on the topic, anybody ever get a report card where it says they could be disruptive, or they can't keep their hands to themselves, or they're very smart and need to try harder? Go ahead and give yourself a point for every report card like that. So now let's talk about how to actually harness your brain and develop strategies for addressing these tendencies. So going back to the hyperfocus and microfocus, I think the biggest one is that time and environment that allows you to give the proper amount of focus. And as Barbara mentioned, your environment isn't just noises and distractions. It could be what's on display and what's hidden away. Or I know that I've read at one point that if you have your workstation, your computer in your bedroom, it can create an association of working in that space that can make it harder to go to sleep because your mind doesn't see that space as a sleeping space as clearly. So sometimes it's also habitual, which we'll dive into some habits in a few minutes too. And there are strategies that are pretty universal for getting into the flow, for putting your mind in the right space to get in the zone for the work you're doing. And those aren't necessarily specific to people with ADHD, but learning those strategies can help you control the mode of focus that you have. Stimulation craving was one where the time and environment also is key, but also finding things that can provide that stimulation without being detrimental. Like I mentioned, the audiobooks. I've made sure to set the expectation that if a family or friend wants to talk to me and I happen to have an earbud in, that is not an indicator that I don't want to participate, that please go ahead and speak up and I'll pull it out. I don't tend to listen when I'm socializing with people, but I try to make sure that the negative impacts are controlled. And if you do have distractions that you want to limit, a lot of times you can, and we'll talk about habit loops and how you can hack those, but the short of it is tie it to completing something you want to achieve in order to get that distraction. By the way, can you, like, if you want to talk about an exciting idea that if you go a few minutes, but you never just can't quite finish, but it's so someone with ADHD can follow, but they just get to where you talk, but you never actually finish one sentence because you're so excited. Go ahead and give yourself a point. Thank you, Deanna. So on the out of sight, out of mind, you're going to see a common trend. Time and environment is key to a lot of these. And I think I actually missed one or two techniques on this one. But I think Barbara hit it right nail on the head, is figure out what environment works best for you to make sure the things that you need to keep in mind are visible to you, whether that's physically or through some of the organizational methods we'll explore in a moment. But for the all or nothing approach, there's a micro moment approach, which means don't look at a big task as a whole, break it up into small things. You know, folding laundry, for instance, that's a overwhelming task for somebody who finds the chore very boring, and they don't want to spend 20 minutes folding laundry, but maybe breaking it up into individual pieces or individual categories of clothing, so it's a smaller chore. And also you can tie those back to rewards. You know, I'm going to go ahead and do this, and I'll get this result at the end. And we'll talk even about how to make habits where you find yourself more driven to do those things without having to force yourself. And then setting time limits, saying I'm going to do this for 5 minutes. It doesn't matter how much progress I make. I'll go ahead and do it for 5 minutes, and then I'm done for now. For perfectionism, one of the things I'm very focused on in my career, in my daily work, is the definition of done and acceptance criteria. You know, what are we actually trying to get out of this? So before you even start, if you decide what are the criteria that'll let me know that I've done this to the level that I need to, you can always choose to go beyond that, but at least you'll have some milestones to tell you, like, at this point, maybe I shouldn't let this project take precedence over other things in my life because I've hit that minimum criteria, and everything else, just based on the definition that I set from the beginning, is extra. And to avoid getting overwhelmed by that perfectionist perspective, sometimes it's better to take like more of an outline approach instead of getting into all the details, to figure out what are the high level things that need to be accomplished. And then I'll just focus on the first one without breaking down everything to a high level of detail. So once you've done your self-analysis, you understand your own tendencies, and you've started to develop some ideas about how you want to go about controlling those, you need to put some structure around it. Which, by the way, this whole process of analyzing, developing strategies, developing structure, it's something that I think a lot of us have learned to do just out of survival. And then I turned around and found that it was really helpful in my job as a manager of developers, to be able to provide them the analysis and the strategies and the structure that we're talking about. So as we go through this one in particular, I'd be thinking about how not only these things can help you personally or somebody you know, but also how you could implement them in your work as you lead others and help them be better at accomplishing what they're trying to do. So the first step, and it's easier said than done, and I don't have a magic bullet for this, but is to stop thinking focusing as much on the negative and more on the positive. Stop thinking as much about trying to keep yourself from being distracted and more on trying to be focused. And it sounds cliche and it's very oversimplified, but I think that will make all of these other techniques and steps much easier. So one of the things that I've found I've done in my life is if there's something that I know I need to decide on, or I need to do, I need to prevent, and I may be less likely to make that correct decision in the moment, like with shopping for something, for instance. If I go out and go to a store and I'm just looking and I get excited about something, I may be likely to just buy it. So maybe my approach is to go online and do a little research and come up with a decision of what to buy ahead of time. So now I'm just going to the store and making the purchase, or more likely probably just ordering it online these days. We'll talk about quite a few tools that you can use to enforce these strategies. They're generally not revolutionary, but they're maybe we apply them in ways that you might not have thought of. And one tool that I haven't quite figured out yet is a way to prevent myself from leaving my food in the microwave. Because if you've tried to heat up coffee or drinks or snacks and routinely forget about it because it's in the microwave and you leave it behind, and then you have to heat it up again, go ahead and give yourself 2 points for that one. So as far as the inattention and inability to control your impulses, the biggest one for me is definitely list making. And that can be a list of tasks. We use Google Keep in my household to note things to purchase or things to pack. There's a lot of really great reasons to use lists. There's this whole mentality that you have loops going on in your mind to remember things, and by divesting yourself of that, by putting it on a list that you know you can trust will make sure that it gets addressed, it takes it off of your mental workload. But more importantly for me, it allows me to organize all those thoughts and have them available when they're important and actionable. And of course that ties in with how you schedule. I rely on my Outlook calendar very much at work, my Google Calendar at home. It's one of those things where if it's not on the calendar, you can't count on it happening. And that's, I guess it is a dependency, but it takes that stress and that anxiety of losing track of time, which is something that is very common with people who have ADHD, is not having a good sense of time and realizing that you've just gotten sucked into something for hours, or constantly checking the clock because you know there's something important coming up. But having the schedule and the reminders are key for me. Email, like most people, this is the point in the presentation where I ask for people to raise their hands, but I'm really interested in how many people actually have organizational techniques for their email, and how many people just have like their inbox and maybe some folders they drop things in. Personally, I have filters in my work Outlook for marking things for internal or external, like did it come from inside my company or outside my company, to apply these labels. I've got labels for if it was addressed to me, like I'm in the to field, if I was in the carbon copy field, because if I'm in the to field, it's much more likely that I need to take action on it. Whereas if I'm in carbon copy, it's probably more for informational purposes and not so time sensitive or critical that I respond to it. So I've got all these filters to help organize things, and that's before I even look at my email. So that way, I've made the decision ahead of time by putting these filters in place, these folders, that I'm going to approach triage a certain way. I'm going to start my day by looking at these things that are most important, and then to tie back into the list making and scheduling, I use Outlook tasks where I can flag an email, so I can say I need to follow up on this urgently. Or I need to follow up on it tomorrow. I can schedule it, and that gives me my list of things to address, because I can't be distracted every time an email comes in, even if it's important. I need to maintain that focus. So it all kind of ties together. And then this all feeds into the bigger effort of project planning, of identifying, what are my goals, what are the objectives that I need to make sure I meet to achieve those goals, and what tasks are required in order to meet the success criteria, right? That definition of done for those objectives to be successful. So when you learn to do this for yourself, for everyday things. Like, I want to build a tree house this weekend, so I'm going to build a project plan, versus somebody who might just go out and get a bunch of lumber and just jump into it and start doing it. But I need that structure to make sure that I accomplish it the way I want to accomplish it. Then you've had years of experience in this effort before you even move into a role professionally where you're doing this for others, where you're taking on a project at work and you're having to help set initiatives and break out responsibilities. And so that's where I think that this mentality can prepare people really well for the leadership roles. And then not forgetting to take breaks, scheduling those if necessary. I have blocked out times on my calendar for work that are intended for productive time, like focused, like I don't need to be distracted. I need to make sure I have at least an hour a day to get certain things done. I also have time blocked out for breaks, for decompressing, stepping away, making sure that I have the proper level of focus and attention when it's needed. And then one of my favorites is outsourcing tasks, right? Particularly in the software development world, we're very fortunate to make a great living. And if I can make more per hour doing something that I'm really good at and have somebody else take care of tasks that are more difficult for me or that I don't excel at as much, that's something I'll generally jump at. And it doesn't necessarily have to be hired work either. Sometimes you can trade. You know, you can partner with somebody who has a different type of mentality, different type of brain, and you can help them in areas that they don't excel as much, and they can help you. I've heard a lot of people doing this in their lives where they have a friend that they partner with and they'll trade off tasks. We've covered quite a bit, and before we jump into the next part, anybody have any questions about any of that? No? All right, well, we'll jump right into habits. And if you accomplish a lot of things on your to-do list, but fail to get the things that matter done, go ahead and give yourself a point for that one. In addition, if your to-do list includes a bunch of mundane tasks because you may forget, but also you like checking things off, go ahead and give yourself another point. Finally, if you then avoid brushing your teeth because it's boring and takes 2 whole minutes, give yourself another point. So let's talk about habits, how you can modify those habits. There's a lot to cover here, and I highly recommend The Power of Habit. It's both a Kindle and audiobook if you're interested. The idea here is that every habit's made up of a cue, a routine, and a reward. So there's something that triggers that behavior. There's some behavior in response to that trigger. And then there's something that ingrains that as something you want to repeat, or something you want to do again in the future. So the cue can be a lot of things. Like, it could be a certain time of day when you're in a certain place. A lot of times there's smells or you know, a lot of marketing is based on this, right? When they pump the smell of food out to draw you into eating establishments. So the first step is recognizing these cues and understanding the components that go into building this habit. So use that extra sensory perception, and if you notice things that other people tend to miss, go ahead and give yourself a point. So when you feel the urge for this habit, when you recognize the cue, ask yourself what time is it, where am I, who am I around, what did I do, what emotions are going on, because emotions are key to habits, right? What do I feel? That's a big one. And then if you really want to be intentional about this, keep a log. Write down, you know, at this time, at this place, because what you identify as the cue, you might find is only part of it, or is adjacent to other things that contribute. So once you identify what your cues are, then I think the other big thing is that reward. You know what the routine is. You've identified what behavior you want to change, or what you want to add or remove, but what's driving you to this habit? So common approaches are to substitute one thing for another. People who smoke, right, that instead of going out for a smoke, they might choose to eat something or try to meet that reward loop in a different way. The key here is to try different things. Every time you try something, you gain a better understanding of what's driving your subconscious to push for that habit. And so once you identify what the cue is and what the reward is, then you have the power to substitute behaviors in between. And if you're writing these out, if you're trying to define them for yourself, which can help you lay your thoughts out pretty clearly, you can write it out as when this happens, I will do this because it provides me with that. Right? So if you're starting to fade, listening to me talk about habits, go ahead and give yourself a point and a protein bar. Apparently protein helps with focus. So we've talked about self-analysis, developing strategies, designing a structure, and then of course we all need support. Self-support is key. I mean, you can't get by without that. So this is where you need to be reasonable with what you expect from yourself. You know, you're not going to be perfect tomorrow. How can we determine whether you're improving each day or each week that you measure your progress? That positivity that I alluded to, but it's difficult to quantify exactly how to make that happen. One big part of that is the positive self-talk. A lot of people will find themselves relying on others. They'll say, you know, negative things about themselves, and they'll look to others to combat that by saying, no, this isn't true, or giving them that encouragement. So learning to be able to talk back to yourself and give yourself that encouragement is a valuable life skill in general, but particularly important to provide yourself support in maintaining these systems. So we talked a little bit about habit loops. Focusing on the rewards for the correct behavior is key. And of course, even if you're interested, you could still be distracted. So give yourself a point if you're getting kind of tired at this point. Oh, if you're falling asleep, give yourself 2 points. And as far as external support, I think it's valuable to both identify people who have similar traits you can identify with and you can bounce ideas off of and collaborate on strategies and techniques. And then of course to find those people who have a different, who are neurodiverse from yourself, so that you can trade tasks and collaborate in a way that takes advantage of their strengths and as yours as well. And there are also coaches, you've probably heard of like life coaches and executive coaches. They're coaches who specifically practice giving people help with addressing ADHD tendencies and other neurodiverse aspects. So I highly recommend those if you try the other steps and you think that that would be beneficial. And finally, if you are actually sound asleep, have somebody else give you 3 points. So the last step, and we're about to wrap up, is periodically reevaluating. If you were like this your whole life, give yourself 3 points. But if you were not like this your whole life, it's important to consider that you might not actually have ADHD. There are other conditions and diagnoses which can lead to some of these things, including depression and anxiety. There is a world of other neurodiversity diagnoses. So maybe talk to people around you who know you best to help figure that out and what direction to go in with your assessment. That's all the slides I have. I'll open it up for questions. Anything that anybody would like to dive into a little bit deeper?